New York, Waldorf Astoria. The grand hall gilded in gold shimmered like a Broadway stage waiting for its curtain to fall. From above, the crystal chandeliers scattered into 1,000 shards of broken glass, cascading down in shimmering streams of light. The soft notes of a violin rose from the corner of the room, blending with the subtle rhythm of footsteps tapping against the marble floor. Light and sound intertwined, forming a lavish symphony that both cradled and suffocated the grieving air of the ceremony. Yet at the very center of that dazzling scene, Alexander Hale sat frozen. The black suit he wore only highlighted the silence in his every gesture. His eyes were fixed on the portrait of his father, Richard Hale, the financial tycoon once regarded as a symbol of Wall Street's power. Alexander looked, then searched, then longed. He searched in the eyes of his relatives for a fragment of comfort, a genuine nod. But all he saw were smiles thin as wax masks, probing stares hidden behind false sympathy. In his mind, a heavy question loomed. What anchor will save me now for so many years? Richard had been both compass and anchor, the force that kept him steady amid the storms of the business world. Now that light had gone out, Alexander felt like a man falling freely into an abyss, with no lifeline left to cling to. The whispers from behind pierced his ears like cold blades. Does he really have what it takes to shoulder this Richard left behind too many secrets? Those words were not enough to kill him, but they cut burning gashes across his pride, making every breath feel as if he were swallowing shards of broken glass. His chest tightened. His hands trembled slightly. His pride was torn open. Alexander clenched his fists, the knuckles turning white beneath the glaring lights. Reason whispered to stay silent, to endure. But pride screamed, you cannot let them see you collapse. The storm of inner conflict surged like waves, hardening his face, darkening his eyes like a deep lake on the verge of breaking its banks. He lifted his gaze to his father's portrait. Richard's calm smile seemed to deliver a wordless message. The real battlefield was not in the wealth or prestige, but in the gaze of the entire family now fixed squarely on him. And it was that very gaze, cold as ice, that made Alexander feel utterly alone, standing within glittering crystal walls where no one inside could truly reach his heart. Loneliness, he realized, had shape. It was like the massive mirror hanging in the hall, radiant with countless beams of light, yet concealing within itself a dark crack, long and deep. In that shadow, Alexander silently wished for an unfamiliar hand to appear, even if unexpected, even if distant, to pull him out of the abyss. A voice, a figure, something that could become salvation, shattering the circle of icy stairs. The violin shifted into a mournful melody. Alexander drew in a breath, but it fractured in his chest, heavy as ashes. He had no idea that such salvation was drawing near, not from relatives of blood or friends of power, but from a stranger, a woman entering the funeral with eyes carrying secrets weighty enough to shatter every fragment of elegant silence. The light still blazed, the crystal still showered light like rain, but in Alexander's mind, a long crack had already formed, running across the shining mirror, like a prophecy of the coming shatter that awaited ahead. The funeral at the Waldorf Astoria went on, layered with overlapping sounds, the soft notes of a violin, the click of high heels against the marble floor, the restrained coughs held back in the hush. Each sound felt like a needle piercing straight into Alexander Hale's mind, blurring the line between real grief and the scripted etiquette of social appearances. He sat still, yet an undercurrent churned inside him. A question pounded in his head. What must I do to escape these prying eyes? He knew that with a single slip, the entire family would conclude he lacked the strength to inherit. But if he stayed silent forever, he would remain nothing more than a faint shadow behind his father. Alexander looked, then searched, then longed for a way out. The whispered talk about Richard's secrets no one knew slithered into his heart like a venomous snake. His pride bled, and from that wound, a reckless idea flared up to appear not alone. If he walked into the family gathering with an extraordinary companion, someone who would make the entire hall turn to look, the balance of power would tilt, even if only slightly. That thought took root quickly. If he kept sitting still, they would crush him in silence. But if he created a shock, at least they would have to take caution. He pictured their eyes changing curiosity, whispers, then silence from surprise. That feeling was like a medicine, bitter but necessary. He asked himself quietly, if someone walked in with me, would I stand stronger if that face were mysterious enough? Could it hide the emptiness I'm carrying? The questions collided in his mind like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. And the more he thought, the more certain he became he needed an unexpected companion. His self-respect protested, reminding him that relying on someone else was a sign of weakness. But the wound of his pride screamed, no. This is a counterstrike. This is the only way to rise. His heart swayed between two cliffs, keeping the lonely pride or betting everything on an appearance that might shake this funeral to its core. A flash of memory crossed his mind all those times Richard entered a boardroom. Never alone. Always someone beside him, a partner, an assistant, or sometimes just an old friend. Yet that presence was enough to turn his father into the center of the room, making the whole space revolve around him. Perhaps his father had understood power comes not only from oneself, but from the figure one chooses to walk with. Alexander drew a deep breath, feeling the cold slice through his chest. He knew he was taking a risk, but silence had been suffocating him for too long. Only one option remained. He had to find a strange face, a puzzle piece no one could guess, to walk into this funeral not as a lonely heir, but as a man seizing back control. That thought made his heart race, like footsteps rushing toward a cliff's edge. Reckless, yes, but necessary. Like plunging into cold water to escape a stifling room. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. Alexander's eyes scanned the grand hall, then slowly closed, as if listening to his heartbeat marking time for a decision. And in that silence, he whispered to himself, if I must find a support, let it be an unexpected one. If I must be saved, let this very recklessness save me. He had no idea that, right on the sidewalk outside, a stranger woman was waiting for fate to draw her steps into his world, and she would become the answer to the chain of questions he had not yet managed to solve on his own. The light still poured down, brilliant yet cold, but in Alexander's heart, a new flame had just been lit, the flame of a reckless decision, ready to burn through every silence around him. New York outside was cloaked in the thin mist of a funeral morning. As he stepped out of the Waldorf Astoria for a brief moment, Alexander Hale found himself craving the dusty street air more than the heavy scent of white lilies thickening the grand hall. He walked briskly along the sidewalk as if the darkness inside him were urging him to find an escape. And there, on the cold stone steps, he saw her. The woman sat tucked beneath the shade of a tree, her hands clutching a worn-out coat at the shoulders. Her face was marked with street dust, yet her eyes shone strangely bright. There was something both weary and defiant, like a hidden flame beneath layers of ash. Alexander stopped. He looked, then searched, then longed, searching for a reason to keep walking, a pretext not to stop. Yet the longing inside him compelled him to meet that gaze. The pull was so strong he thought fate itself had placed her into the frame of his life, just when he needed an unexpected companion. Are you waiting for someone? His voice was low, trying to sound calm. The woman lifted her head, squinting against the sunlight flickering through the branches. No, she answered briefly, her voice hoarse from the early wind. I'm just resting. You're looking at me like an experiment. Alexander froze for a second, the words sliced cleanly, without pretense, like a blade both sharp and cold. He let out a quiet laugh, though his heart swayed. Maybe I am just looking for something unusual. Then you're looking at the wrong person, she replied, her eyes still locked on him. Her gaze was so sharp it seemed to pierce through the outer shell of his expensive suit to reach the fragile place he was trying to hide. He did not retreat. The more he faced her, the more Alexander felt himself drawn in, as if she were the answer to the decision that had just sparked in his mind inside the hall. What if I said, I needed someone to go with me, just for tonight? Would you agree? She arched an eyebrow. You think I'd walk into a place full of silk dresses and diamonds just to be your backdrop? Alexander stayed silent for a few seconds. The hiss of a bus's brakes and a taxi's horn echoed from the street. The whole city seemed to be witnessing this brief yet tense conversation. Not a backdrop, he said slowly, emphasizing each word. A highlight. You could turn my silence into something else. You could stop all those eyes in there from stripping me bare. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening, but her voice still cool. You don't know who I am, or what I'm carrying with me. Are you sure you won't regret it? Alexander inhaled. If, then. He remembered how he had sworn if he didn't make a jolt, he would drown in those crystal lights. And now, before him, that jolt had taken the shape of an unknown woman. I'm not sure, he admitted, his voice tight. But I'd rather regret trying than regret missing it. A pause. The wind slipped through, lifting a few strands of her hair, making them shimmer in the sunlight. She smiled faintly, a smile like a small crack in the ice. All right, I'll go with you. But remember, I'm not a puppet for you to control. The short, sharp answer fell into the crowded street like an arrow piercing Alexander's heart. He nodded slightly, feeling his heartbeat quicken, not only because his reckless plan was now real, but because he knew this moment had altered the course of the funeral, and perhaps the course of his entire life. The Hale family's limousine turned off Park Avenue, the neon lights and exhaust fumes flickering against the tinted glass. Inside the car, Alexander Hale sat upright, his hand unconsciously twisting his father's old wedding ring on his ring finger. Across from him, the stranger he had just met, Emily Ward, leaned her head quietly against the window. Both remained silent, with only the steady hum of the engine reminding them that time was rushing forward. Alexander cast a glance at Emily. Through the dim light filtering in from the window, he could see the traces of dust still clinging to her hair and the frayed shoulder of her worn coat. In that moment, a flicker of worry crossed his mind if Emily walked into the grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria looking like this. Those cold, piercing eyes would tear her apart instantly, and at the same time, the reckless plan he had just devised would crumble. We need to prepare, Alexander said, his voice hoarse but resolute. Emily turned the corner of her lips, lifting slightly. Prepare as in turning me into a doll wrapped in an evening gown. Alexander shook his head, his gaze steady on her. No. To let you walk in there as someone who belongs to that world. Not the background, but the centerpiece. Emily's eyes flickered. She neither nodded nor refused, only stayed silent, as though weighing whether to accept or to abandon. The limousine turned onto a small street and stopped in front of Maison Blanche, a boutique famed for serving the elite. From the wide glass windows, warm golden light spilled out, illuminating gowns displayed like works of art. Inside, a faint fragrance of perfume lingered in the air. A silver-haired stylist named Lorraine approached, bowing respectfully to Alexander before turning to Emily with a scrutinizing look. Alexander gave a slight nod, a command without words. Emily was guided to sit before a large mirror. The reflection revealed a woman unfamiliar, a slender face, eyes bright but veiled in fatigue. Lorraine began her work, each brush of powder, each curl of hair meticulously crafted. Every stroke seemed to wash away the dust of the streets, restoring the presence hidden beneath. Alexander stood behind, eyes fixed on the mirror. He noticed Emily was not at all flustered. She sat calmly, unnervingly composed, as if already accustomed to the blinding lights and the scrutiny of cold stares. That realization sent a chill through him. Who was Emily Ward? How could someone huddled on a sidewalk carry the aura of one who had walked red carpets? Emily lightly touched the mirror, her voice soft but sharp. Do you think a layer of makeup will change the way people look at me? Alexander. Alexander stepped closer, locking eyes with her through the glass. No, but it will change how they see you in the first moment. And sometimes, the first moment is enough to define the whole game. Emily let out a quiet laugh, tilted, thin like a scratch on glass. You sound like something my father once taught. Alexander froze for a beat, the words stumbling across the current of time. He wanted to ask, but Emily's eyes had already drifted away, leaving the hint suspended in the air like a needle stuck in his curiosity. When Lorraine finished, Emily turned her chair. Her appearance was now transformed hair neatly tied, skin aglow under the light, lips touched with just enough red. Not a beauty of extravagance, but a quiet allure that compelled others to look twice. Alexander felt his heart drop a beat. He no longer saw just an unexpected ally for tonight's plan. He saw a mystery, a question mark strong enough to halt every gaze in the grand hall. The limousine rolled once more toward the Waldorf Astoria. In the reflection of the window, Alexander saw his figure and Emily side by side, two silhouettes from seemingly different worlds yet moving together. He understood then, sometimes salvation doesn't come from the hand that pulls us up, but from the figure we choose to stand with. And tonight, that figure Emily Ward had transformed into an enigma, powerful enough to shake the funeral of Richard Hale. The grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria once again opened its heavy glass doors. Crystal lights cascaded down like a shower of stars, deliberately arranged to encircle the powerful. The sound of violins echoed, blending with the rhythm of hundreds of polished shoes, creating a music charged with authority. The funeral space seemed frozen in place until Alexander Hale strode in with Emily Ward at his side. In that very moment, the entire room seemed to tilt. Necks turned, eyes widened. Whispers shot out from every direction like invisible arrows. Who is she? Why is she with Alexander? Never seen her in the family. The stream of murmurs rose like relentless waves. Yet it was exactly what Alexander had anticipated. And now, he saw it working. Emily walked beside him, her elegant black dress embracing her figure, her hair tied high and gleaming under the light. Each step she took seemed to make the marble floor resound, drawing every gaze. Not the appearance of someone being led, but of someone choosing to walk straight into the storm. Alexander glanced over. In Emily's eyes, he saw a composure that was almost terrifying, a calmness not easily faked. His heart tightened. Who was she? Really? The entire hall began to stir more loudly. Elderly Aunt Margaret Hale raised her hand to cover her mouth, whispering to the family lawyer. Thomas Reed Richard must have left behind more secrets than we ever imagined. Thomas gave no reply, only furrowing his brow, his eyes fixed on Emily as though trying to peel back every layer of her past. Alexander knew that every look cast at her was an unspoken interrogation. But instead of fear, he felt strengthened. Emily's presence was both shield and spear at once, protecting and striking. They approached the funeral table. The sound of their shoes rang out clearly, like a rhythm resetting the heavy beat of the ceremony. For a fleeting moment, Alexander realized he was no longer alone. He had succeeded in the risky distraction he had wagered on. Emily bowed her head slightly before Richard Hale's portrait. In that instant, the room that had been buzzing suddenly fell quiet. A strange stillness spread, as if everyone were waiting for her to say something, but Emily remained silent, letting a faint smile brush across her lips in place of words, a smile that made even the most prying tongues falter. Alexander drew a deep breath. He knew the battle had not begun yet, but he had already turned the board. And Emily was the piece that forced everyone else to rethink their strategy. Dear listener, can you feel the pulse of the hall when Emily walked in with Alexander? That sensation was like a strange breeze sweeping through a room thick with incense, making everyone hold their breath. Tell me in the comments if you were Alexander. Would you dare to bring a stranger from the streets into such a funeral, filled with scrutinizing eyes? Or would you choose silence, allowing rumors to shred your dignity apart? Don't forget to hit subscribe to The Soft. Why to keep following this story? Each new part will be another emotional wave as secrets are slowly unveiled and the fates of Alexander and Emily become more tightly bound. Your support is the very force that allows these heartfelt stories to continue to be told, reaching and touching more people. Inside the grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria, the atmosphere of the funeral seemed to have steadied after the shocking arrival of Alexander Hale and Emily Ward. But then, another figure approached, carrying with him an undercurrent of tension. Charles Hale, Alexander's cousin, a man who had long harbored ambition within the family. Charles moved closer, his silver-gray suit standing out beneath the crystal light. His face was weathered, yet his eyes gleamed with triumph. He extended a hand in a formal greeting, his lips curling into a thin smile. Alexander, I did not expect you to know how to surprise people this much. His voice lingered, soft as silk, but sharp as a blade. Alexander remained calm, answering with a measured smile. I only did what needed to be done today. Charles. Charles's eyes flicked toward Emily, his gaze sharp as if trying to pierce through the gown she wore. And then there is this. Everyone is curious. Who is this honored guest, a stranger, appeared right at Richard Hale's funeral? There must be a special reason. Emily did not lower her head. On the contrary, she kept her back straight, her eyes steady. I only came with Alexander. Nothing more. Nothing less. The brief reply fell like an arrow into the conversation. The group around them stirred uneasily. Margaret Hale frowned, while attorney Thomas Reed observed more closely, his eyes holding questions he had not yet voiced. Charles sneered. I once thought Richard would leave us a solemn funeral, untouched by any theatrics. But perhaps I was mistaken. I used to believe this family only opened its arms to those it accepted, but it seems that is not the case. Alexander drew a deep breath. Charles's words were not only aimed at Emily, but also like a dagger directed at him, implying he was breaking the family's order. Charles, he said slowly, each word pressed down like a weight. This is my father's funeral. If you truly want to honor him, then don't use it as a weapon. Alexander's voice shattered the silence, like a hammer striking glass. Those nearby flinched slightly. Emily tilted her head toward him, her lips curving into a faint, unreadable smile, half surprised, half pleased. But Charles did not retreat. You are too quick-tempered. Alexander, I only meant to give you my blessing. May you find companionship that your father never allowed. His tone was soft, but each word cut like a velvet-wrapped knife. Emily's eyes fluttered shut briefly, as though his words stirred old memories. When she opened them again, her gaze was icy. There are things people refuse to accept, not because they are wrong, but because they are afraid. Her voice rang steady, neither high nor low, yet strong enough to make several people nearby hold their breath. The tension hung in the air like a string pulled to its breaking point. Alexander felt his hand clenched tightly, veins rising across his knuckles. Within him echoed a silent vow. Do not let them see you as my weakness. You must be my strength. At that moment, Charles curved his lips, as if he had just finished testing new battle lines. Very well, let us see what other surprises this ceremony might bring. He withdrew, leaving behind a suffocating space in his wake. Alexander and Emily stood side by side, both knowing the real battle had only just begun. The music inside the Waldorf Astoria ballroom shifted from sorrowful violin notes to a slow, gentle waltz, as if trying to soothe the tension that had just flared during the confrontation between Alexander Hale and Charles Hale. The candles flickered on the long tables, their golden glow bathing every face. making the funeral atmosphere feel for a fleeting moment more like a grand ball than a farewell. Alexander stood still for a few seconds, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, still murmuring in whispers. Then, as if reclaiming control, he turned to Emily Ward. "Would you like to dance?" he asked softly, his voice lowered so the invitation seemed meant only for her, unheard by anyone else. Emily frowned slightly. "Here." At a funeral, Alexander nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Sometimes, just one waltz is enough to make people stop judging. And I need to breathe." A pause stretched between them. Emily looked deep into his eyes, as though weighing the moment. Then she placed her hand in his, delicate yet firm. "All right, but only once." The music swelled. Alexander led Emily to the center of the hall. Their steps merged with the rhythm of the waltz, slow and graceful. His shoes tapped lightly against the marble floor, his heartbeat drumming like a second, private melody only he and Emily could hear. In Alexander's arms, Emily held her proud gaze. Their closeness let him hear her breathing steady, calm, as if syncing itself with his heart. For a brief moment, he forgot about the hundreds of eyes watching. "You once belonged to this world, didn't you?" Alexander asked quietly, his voice trembling as if afraid to shatter the music. Emily didn't answer right away. She let a few beats of the waltz pass before speaking, her tone soft yet sharp. "I once knew what it was like to stand under blinding lights, to endure every scrutinizing stare, and I once walked away from it all." "Why?" Alexander asked, his steps faltering for an instant. Emily tilted her head, her eyes carrying both weariness and mystery. "Because not everyone has the strength to stand in the light forever. Sometimes the shadows are the only place a person can survive." Her words caught in Alexander's throat. Curiosity and empathy swelled inside him. He realized this woman hadn't appeared by chance. Every word she spoke was like a shard of glass reflecting truths he had yet to face. The music drew them deeper into the spin. Alexander's hand gripped Emily's more tightly than necessary, as though afraid she might slip away. Emily sensed it and murmured, "You cannot lean on me just to prove yourself. If you want to stand tall, you must first know who you are." The words fell lightly, like a breath, yet echoed loudly in Alexander's heart. A wave of shame spread through him, like ink dissolving in water. Was she right? Was he seeking salvation in a stranger because he was too afraid to face himself as the music neared its end? Alexander bent close and whispered, "Perhaps you're right, but at least tonight, I am not alone." Emily said nothing, only her eyes softened, her guardedness easing for a fleeting instant. When the final notes faded, the ballroom fell silent for a few seconds. Then, scattered applause broke out, uncertain whether it was admiration or simply a way to fill the air. But Alexander knew one thing the moment just shared had planted a question in everyone's mind. Who was Emily Ward? Really? The waltz came to an end, and Alexander Hale, along with Emily Ward, stopped at the center of the Waldorf Astoria's Grand Hall, the room, which had just witnessed an intimate moment between the two, still buzzed like a lake disturbed by a thrown stone. Ripples not yet faded. The crystal lights poured down, making them the center of attention, even though they had not spoken a single word. But that silence lasted only a moment. A group of family members began to approach investors, relatives, and a few familiar politicians. The atmosphere shifted. If just a moment ago, Alexander had been the one under scrutiny, now he and Emily have become the focal point everyone wants to test. Alexander, a male voice called Thomas Reed, the family's longtime lawyer, tall and composed. He offered a polite smile and then glanced at Emily. "We are very curious about your new companion." Emily answered calmly, unfazed. Curiosity is a double-edged sword. It can lead to truth, or it can just create more rumors. That remark made the whole group pause. Alexander caught several startled looks, some intrigued, some cautious. A faint smile crossed his lips. It was precisely that sharpness that turned Emily into a force the moment she opened her mouth. A gray-haired businessman interjected. "Are you interested in finance? Miss Ward, I only ask because today we are bidding farewell to a man who built an empire." Emily slowly nodded. Finance is not just numbers. It is trust. Without trust, money is just paper. It is trust that keeps an empire alive. The space grew heavier. Her answer was brief, precise but resolute. Some nodded, others exchanged subtle glances. Alexander realized Emily was not merely blending in. She was taking the stage. He recalled his father's words in a room full of power. The one who controls the story will control the gaze. And now, the one doing that was not him, but Emily Ward. Charles Hale appeared again, standing nearby, lips curved in a faint smirk. Well said, but trust can vanish like smoke. A single gust of rumor is enough to blow it all away. Emily turned to him, eyes bright yet voice still gentle. True, but smoke only drifts away when there is no fire to hold it. When the fire is strong enough, it forces everyone to look. Her reply sparked a few chuckles. A politician clapped lightly, half joking, half sincere. Miss Ward speaks better than many speakers I have heard. Standing beside her, Alexander felt a storm inside. Pride stirred in him, yet so did a sting of unease. Emily commands the spotlight while he, the heir to Richard Hale's empire, is being overshadowed. He took a quiet sip of wine, trying to mask the flicker of jealousy. But in his heart, he knew he stood at a crossroads, either learn to walk with Emily as an ally, or risk becoming a bystander in his own story under the pull of her magnetism. Emily turned toward him, her gaze softening slightly. Alexander, what do you think that question was like planting a flag, handing him back the reins of control? Alexander drew a steady breath. I think my father would smile if he heard this, because the empire he built was not raised on numbers alone, but on trust. And tonight, I believe everyone here is hoping to keep that flame alive. His words drew nods of agreement. Emily looked at him, offering a faint smile, as if acknowledging that he had just claimed back part of the stage. As the next strains of music drifted through the air, Alexander realized something in this moment. He and Emily were not just withstanding doubtful gazes. They were learning how to command them, rather than be consumed by them. When the music faded, Alexander Hale suddenly felt Charles Hale's heavy hand press down on his shoulder. The polite smile was still painted across his cousin's face, but in his eyes was a blade-sharp glare. Alexander, we need to have a private word, Charles said, his voice low, just enough to be heard, yet carrying the weight of a silent command. Alexander glanced at Emily Ward. She gave a slight nod, her eyes reassuring. Go, I'll be fine. He drew in a breath, gently removed Charles's hand, and followed him out into the marble-paved corridor. The door closed behind them, shutting out the noise of the grand hall and leaving only an icy silence. Charles turned, the social smile vanishing. Do you think that little show in the hall is enough to fool the entire family, bringing an unknown woman to Richard's funeral? You are tarnishing our name. Alexander held his gaze steady. I didn't bring her here to fool anyone. I brought her because I needed someone to stand beside me. And I don't need your permission. Charles's voice tightened, clipped, and harsh. Are you trying to prove something? Or are you just so afraid that you need a shadow to hide behind? Alexander's chest constricted, pride flaring like fire? No, I'm not hiding. I'm choosing, and my choice has nothing to do with you. Charles let out a cold, empty laugh. You're digging your own grave. I will never let this estate fall into the hands of a weak man, especially one being led around by a woman. Alexander stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until their breaths nearly touched. Don't insult Emily. She is not a puppet, and I am not the shadow you think you can control. The air grew taut as a string stretched to breaking. Charles tilted his head, his voice low, but each word carried the hidden edge of a knife. You think you're in control, but you're only being swept away. Don't forget, power in this family has never belonged to the weak-hearted. Alexander clenched his jaw, every muscle standing out. He wanted to strike, but forced himself to hold back. He remembered Emily's eyes just before the door closed, eyes that had whispered, "Don't let pride make you the loser." "You can call me whatever you like," Alexander said, his voice low and measured, each word falling heavy as stone. "But you will never have the right to decide who I am." Charles studied him for a long moment, then burst into a dry, hollow laugh that echoed down the empty corridor. "We'll see. Soon enough, you'll know who truly controls this game." He walked away, his footsteps reverberating against the marble, leaving Alexander alone. Alexander leaned back against the wall, his chest heaving. Anger, frustration, jealousy, helplessness, all of it churned together, burning like fire trapped inside an iron cage. He closed his eyes, asking himself, am I protecting Emily? Or am I using her to mask the fear that I'm not strong enough for a fleeting moment? He wasn't sure anymore. When Alexander Hale returned to the grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria, the crystal light still blazed, but inside him, the chill from his confrontation with Charles Hale lingered. Emily Ward stood near the funeral altar, her eyes glowing in the candlelight, as if struggling to maintain composure amid the curious stares surrounding her. Charles did not leave right away. Instead, he chose a different approach. He walked slowly toward Emily, his lips curling into a polite smile while his eyes gleamed with the edge of a blade. "Miss Ward," Charles spoke loudly enough for a few people nearby to hear. "They say your appearance here today is not a coincidence. Perhaps you had some connection to Richard Hale, or maybe Alexander just happened to bring you along to attract attention." Emily stayed silent for a moment, then calmly replied, "People always like to attach meaning to everything, even to things that mean nothing." Charles chuckled softly, a pleasant sound laced with menace. "True, but I've seen many people step into this world just to find their footing, and when the truth comes out, the light is no longer gentle. It is more like a blade than a candle." The air around them grew taut. Those standing nearby shifted slightly, as if to catch the words more clearly. Emily did not flinch. She looked Charles straight in the eye, her voice steady and slow. "Light only becomes a blade when someone uses it to harm. For me, light is always an opportunity to speak what needs to be spoken." Alexander had just arrived. Hearing every word exchanged, his heart pounded, a mixture of fear and admiration. He could see clearly that Charles was not only attacking Emily, but also planting seeds of suspicion among the crowd. "Who is she? Why is she present at this funeral?" He stepped forward, his voice firm. "Charles, this is not the time to spread shadows. This funeral is for my father, not a stage for you to script suspicion." But Charles's hidden blade had already struck. Eyes around them began to trade glances, whispers layering into more questions. Alexander clenched his fists. He knew that from now on, every step Emily took would be scrutinized twice over. Emily tilted her head slightly, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes. "If people truly want to know who I am not afraid to answer. But I will do so, at the right time." In that instant, Alexander felt both rescued and pulled deeper into the storm. He realized Emily was not the least bit shaken, but the price of her calm was a tempest slowly forming around them. "My dear friend, can you feel it too?" The way Charles cast suspicion was like dropping a stone into a lake, each ripple spreading out to touch everyone. "The question now is, who is Emily Ward? An unexpected companion, or a dangerous piece hidden within the Hale family? I want to hear your thoughts. If you were Alexander, would you trust Emily completely, no matter the whispers, or would you step back, protecting yourself from the storm of doubt? Share your view in the comments. I truly want to know your perspective. And don't forget to subscribe to The Soft Why. Every next chapter of this story is not only about tension, but also about a journey of trust, truth, and the choices we make about who we stand beside in our most fragile moments. Your support is the motivation that allows these stories to reach more and more hearts. In the heavy air of the funeral, the doubts Charles Hale had sown still lingered like poisonous mist. Alexander Hale stood beside Emily Ward, his heart in turmoil. He wanted to sweep away all the prying gazes, yet he knew the truth would soon come knocking. And at that very moment, Thomas Reed, the family lawyer, stepped out from the pews, holding a thick folder in his hands. The crystal lights cast their glow on the brown leather cover, reflecting like a blade cutting into the luxurious atmosphere. Thomas's voice was firm. It is time for the family to know. Richard Hale, the man we are bidding farewell to today, did not leave behind the flawless life many believed. The entire hall trembled. Whispers spread like flames catching dry paper. Alexander held his breath, his eyes locked on the folder in Thomas's hand, his heartbeat pounding like war drums. Emily remained calm, her eyes shining with an unusual light, as if she had already braced herself for this moment. Thomas opened the folder and drew out piece after piece of evidence. An old birth certificate with Richard Hale's name listed under father, a series of handwritten letters, undeniable in their script, and a faded photograph of Richard standing beside a young woman, holding a baby girl. Emily Ward. The room fell silent. Each piece of evidence landed on the table like three heavy hammers, shattering the polished silence. So it is, Thomas said slowly, each word like a strike of a metronome. Emily Ward is not a stranger. She is the secret daughter of Richard Hale, a truth concealed for many years, now resurfacing to claim its place. Alexander was stunned. It felt as though the ground beneath his feet had cracked wide open. He looked at Emily, searching for a sign of denial, but she stood there, her gaze steady and heartbreakingly calm. In her eyes, he saw both acknowledgement and an old wound that had never healed. Charles let out a harsh laugh. I told you so. Showing up here was no coincidence. A bastard child, now returning to demand her share of the inheritance. Emily turned to Charles, her voice low but sharp as steel. I don't need anyone to save me. I don't need an inheritance to exist. I only want the truth to be acknowledged. He was my father. Whether admitted or denied, that truth remains unchanged. The hall froze. The whispers stopped. Now the eyes upon her were not only suspicious, but tinged with respect. Amid the sea of people, Emily neither trembled nor hid. She faced the truth head on. Alexander clenched his fists. A flood of emotions rose within him, pain at being kept outside the circle of secrets, but also admiration for Emily's courage. Father, why did you hide your daughter from the world, and why burden your son with a legacy stripped of its full truth? Emily stepped closer to the funeral altar and bowed before Richard Hale's portrait. Her voice quivered slightly but rang clear. I did not come here to demand anything. I came to say goodbye, like any other child would. Those simple yet profound words moved many to tears. In that instant, the funeral was no longer just an elegant ritual. It became the place where truth ignited like a flame, illuminating the long-buried cracks in the Hale family. After Thomas Reed's documents were revealed, the grand hall of the Waldorf Astoria sank into a suffocating silence. The whispers had vanished, leaving only heavy gazes fixed on Alexander Hale and Emily Ward. The light from the crystal chandeliers poured down like thousands of eyes, both judging and exposing. Alexander stood frozen, his mind spinning. The fragments locked within Thomas's file drilled deep into his thoughts. The old birth certificate, the handwritten letters, the photograph of Richard Hale holding a baby girl. All of them screamed an undeniable truth. Emily was not an outsider. She was the secret daughter of the father. The entire family had just been laid to rest. Alexander's heart pounded fast. He looked at Emily and saw in her eyes not denial, but a proud sorrow. She was not someone scheming for a place, but a child returning to be acknowledged. Charles Hale broke the silence with a dry laugh. I told you, showing up here wasn't some coincidence. The illegitimate child finally came to claim her share. Didn't she? Those words felt like salt rubbed into an open wound, but Emily did not flinch. She turned, her eyes locked on Charles, her voice calm yet firm. I didn't come here to take anything. I don't need anyone to save me. I don't need an inheritance to survive. I just want the truth to be recognized. He was my father. Whether you accept it or deny it, the truth remains. Her words fell like a hammer blow, splitting the silence. Some family members lowered their heads, others looked away. Alexander watched Emily, and for the first time since the funeral began, he felt his chest ease. In her was a strength he had never seen in anyone else in the family, the strength of someone with nothing to lose, yet everything to prove. Thomas Reed cleared his throat before speaking in a steady voice. Richard Hale left behind a vast fortune, but more importantly, he left behind a truth that cannot be denied. Alexander and Emily, you may be different, but you share the same bloodline. And if this family still wishes to endure, it must learn to accept that truth, instead of burying it in darkness. His words echoed through the hall, deepening the silence for some, while stirring unease in others. Alexander understood that this truth had changed everything. He stepped closer to Emily, standing firmly beside her. His voice rang out, unwavering. Emily is not a joke. She is not a shadow. She is the truth, and truth does not need anyone's permission to exist. Emily lifted her head slightly, her eyes flashing bright for a moment. She whispered, just loud enough for Alexander to hear, "You don't need to save me." Alexander looked at her, his eyes heavy with emotion. I know, you don't need anyone to save you, but I choose to stand with you. In that instant, the invisible thread torn apart by secrets was tied back together. Emily gently squeezed his hand. It was not a plea for rescue, but an agreement, a silent vow. We will walk forward together. Charles narrowed his eyes but said nothing this time. He understood that his attack had not divided them. It had, unintentionally, created a new alliance. Bathed in the warm golden light, Alexander and Emily stood side by side, no longer two strangers bound by a reckless plan, but two pieces of the same bloodline, united by a shared purpose to protect Richard Hale's legacy and uncover the buried truth. Thomas watched, nodding thoughtfully. Some secrets were once chains, but when brought to light, they become foundations. From now on, neither of you will be alone. Emily replied softly but clearly, not alone. Alexander repeated, like an oath to himself, not alone. The hall remained silent, but within the air there was now a crack of light, small yet steadfast like dawn slipping through a narrow door, heralding a different beginning. Dawn painted the Manhattan sky in shades of gold. But inside Alexander Hale's penthouse, that light brought no peace. The phone kept ringing, each chime hammering into his temples. When he unlocked the screen, a barrage of headlines appeared. Cold and merciless, Richard Hale's secret illegitimate child revealed. Alexander Hale brings an unknown woman to the funeral, but the family is divided. Emily Ward, rightful heir or opportunist. Every word pierced his pride like a needle. Alexander sank into the chair, his hand clenched so tightly it turned pale. He remembered his vow to Emily, not alone. But with the storm of news sweeping across every paper, every site, could he truly keep that promise? In the living room, Emily was already seated. The morning paper lay wide open before her, her face printed boldly on the front page. She showed no fear, only folding her hands on her lap, her gaze calm like a lake awaiting the storm. When Alexander stepped closer, she lifted her head, her voice quiet but firm. They've begun. Alexander swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Charles, it has to be him behind this. Emily nodded slightly. First, the article, then the threats, and finally, an invitation, a trap already set. The prediction sent a chill down Alexander's spine. And indeed, less than an hour later, his phone rang again. On the other end, the voice of Charles's assistant sounded polite yet suspiciously sweet. Mr. Charles cordially invites Mr. Hale and Miss Ward to a private meeting this evening to clarify matters before public opinion turns into a crisis. Alexander gripped the phone tightly. Rage rose in him like a tide. This was exactly the trap Emily had warned about. A sweet invitation wrapped around a cold blade. He turned to Emily, his voice cracking with anger. He wants to drag us into the spotlight, to make you the prey at the center of his hunt. He wants to kill both your credibility and mine. Emily remained calm. She didn't look away. She met his eyes directly. If we refuse, the slander will only grow. If we accept, at least we have a chance to turn the tables. The question is, do you dare to step in? Alexander felt cornered. In his mind echoed his late father's words, "In the storm, the one who dares to stand tall is the one who leads." He looked at Emily for a long time, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but a quiet, steadfast flame. He drew a deep breath, as if swallowing that fire into his own heart. "I won't let you face this alone. We'll go, but not to defend. We'll go to strike back." For a moment, silence lingered. Then Emily's lips curved into a faint smile, tinged with warmth. "Then let's prepare, because the real storm has only just begun." Outside the glass window, New York pulsed with noise, cars flowing endlessly through the streets. But for Alexander and Emily, time seemed to pause. They knew that from this moment on, they were no longer two separate individuals. They had become a single alliance standing against an empire determined to consume them. The evening at the Waldorf Astoria, the grand conference hall was decorated like a stage. The brilliant chandeliers cast their glow over rows of tables draped in white cloth, where powerful figures from finance, media, and politics had gathered. Every gaze turned toward Alexander Hale and Emily Ward as they entered. This was no longer a solemn funeral. It was a public showdown orchestrated by Charles Hale. Charles stood at the center, his cold smile sharp as a velvet-wrapped blade. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight, we will clarify the rumors surrounding Richard Hale's legacy and the sudden appearance of Miss Emily Ward." Camera flashes sparked relentlessly. Reporters lifted their notebooks in unison. The media storm had been waiting, only for Charles to deliver his final strike. He raised a stack of papers, his voice echoing, "This is an internal financial report, proving that Alexander has exploited the funeral to manipulate trust, bringing an unknown woman into this family. More than that, I have evidence that Emily Ward is nothing but an imposter, taking advantage of a coincidence in a few old documents." Whispers spread through the hall. Some reporters scribbled quickly, while several cameras zoomed straight in on Alexander's face. Alexander drew a deep breath, turmoil churning inside. But before he could respond, Emily stepped forward, her stance upright, her gaze unwavering. She laid out 3 pieces of evidence that Thomas Reed had entrusted to her: a birth certificate, a handwritten letter, and an old photograph. Her voice rang steady, without a trace of tremor. "Charles, you may call me by any name you like, but the truth cannot be erased. This is Richard Hale's signature on my birth certificate. This is his familiar handwriting in the letters he wrote to my mother, and this is a photograph of him holding me as a child. 3 pieces, not coincidence, but truth." The atmosphere fell still. Camera flashes paused for a moment, as if even the press had been silenced by the weight of undeniable proof. Charles curled his lip, struggling to keep control. Photos can be forged. Papers can be fabricated. Who can prove their authenticity? Thomas Reed stepped forward from behind, his voice firm and deep. "I have served as the Hale family's legal counsel for over 20 years. I confirm that every one of these documents is authentic and preserved in the original records." The hall erupted again, this time with more than doubt. There was acknowledgement, even respect. Some journalists rose to their feet, directing their cameras toward Emily. Alexander moved forward, standing beside Emily, his voice resounding and resolute. You tried to bring us down with rumors, Charles, but the truth always has a form, with documents, with signatures, and tonight, the truth has spoken. My father may have hidden a secret, but that secret was not a shame. It was part of this family. The room exploded. The buzz of voices rose and cameras flashed in a frenzy. Charles flushed red, his eyes burning with fury, yet no words remained to counter. At that very moment, 2 police officers entered, followed by a prosecutor. A commanding voice announced, "We have received reports of forged documents and fabricated claims made for personal gain. Mr. Charles Hale, you will come with us." The hall shook. Charles staggered back, his face drained of color. The cold snap of handcuffs closed in, ringing out like a final bell. Every eye fixed on him, the man who had once spread doubt, now unmasked at the very stage he had set. Emily watched, her eyes glistening but without tears. Alexander stood beside her, his shoulders taut, yet within him a space had been freed at last. "Curtain down," he murmured softly, but with steel in his voice. After the cold steel of the handcuffs locked tightly around Charles Hale's wrists, the conference room at the Waldorf Astoria slowly quieted down. The whispers, the suspicious glances, all gradually faded away, leaving behind a silence unlike before. Not heavy, but lighter, like the calm after a thunderstorm. Alexander Hale stood beside Emily Ward, the 2 of them quietly looking at each other. No words were needed. They both understood that this battle was not only about protecting their honor, but also about reclaiming the truth that had been hidden for far too long. And now, that truth had been revealed. Emily gently turned toward the portrait of Richard Hale, displayed with reverence at the end of the room. In the golden glow cast by the candles, her late father's face seemed to wear a gentle smile. She whispered, "I have come, not to demand anything, only to say goodbye and to be acknowledged." Alexander heard her words clearly. His chest burned, like a wound just beginning to close, still aching, yet slowly healing. He placed his hand lightly on Emily's shoulder. "From now on, neither of us will be alone. Whether as siblings or as 2 people who once walked through loneliness, we will move forward together." Emily looked at him, her eyes softening. The constant wariness she carried had faded, replaced by trust. "Not alone," she repeated, her voice warm and steady, as though carving a promise into the very air. The grand hall still held people, but no one spoke. Instead, the atmosphere itself seemed to step aside, giving way to a moment of healing between 2 souls who had stood in the storm and refused to fall. Thomas Reed stepped forward, resting a hand on Alexander's shoulder before turning to Emily. "Richard may have made a mistake in hiding the truth, but the 2 of you have turned that mistake into strength. This empire doesn't need more layers of deception. It needs truth and trust." Emily nodded. "We will rebuild, not with money, but by showing people who we truly are." Alexander tightened his hand into a fist, not in anger, but in resolve. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but now he had Emily, part blood, part companion. No more long nights wondering who would be his anchor, for he had found it, not in the numbers his father left behind, but in the very truth that once seemed unbearable. The lights in the hall slowly dimmed. People departed, leaving behind a silence as gentle as dawn. Beyond the glass doors, New York City still blazed with light, streets and buildings glowing like the heartbeat of a colossal body. Alexander and Emily walked out together, shoulders side by side, neither ahead, neither behind. Dear listener, do you feel its strangeness after all the storms? What remains is not victory or defeat, but healing. Sometimes, family is not found in bloodlines, but in those who choose to stand beside us when the world turns its back. I want to invite you to pause for a moment and reflect on yourself. Have you ever lived through a moment when the truth, however painful, became the path that led you back to trust. Have you ever had an Emily or an Alexander in your life? Someone who made sure you were no longer alone. Share your story in the comments. I truly want to read and listen. And if you feel this journey has touched your heart, please share it so others can also experience it. Don't forget to subscribe to The Soft Why to continue walking with us through stories where the darkness is lit by faith, where wounds turn into strength. Because every time you listen, comment, or share, you are not only supporting us, you are becoming part of this healing journey not only for Alexander and Emily, but also for yourself. And for anyone who may need this reminder, you are not alone.